Okay, everybody, hello. It is Joseph P. Farrell. It is Friday, September 2nd, 2011. And this is news and views from the Nefarium for the day. And I had a very interesting comment I want to read to you on the website. And I want to comment on the comment because I get this question a lot. And I think it's time to address it because it kind of fits in with the book that I'm writing now. It's going to be an unusual book. Um, I think I've said this before in the previous news and views from the Nefarium that it's not an exciting book, but it's a necessary one. But I want to read what this gentleman had to say. It's a comment that I received this morning in response to my blog about the European debt situation in Germany. All right. And he said this. He said, quote, "The more we dig and the more we understand, the more we are anxious about what is going to happen in the future. I personally hope that there is calm after the storm, as there always is in life. But these events have been building up for decades, if not centuries," and he's right there. It's a centuries old problem, not a decades old problem. This is, and let me stop right there because there's a certain segment of you out there that believe that either the Nazis are all powerful and omnicompetent, which I certainly don't believe, or that the Anglo-American bankers are all powerful and omnicompetent, and that in either case, their plans are always so well laid and so well crafted that they always work out exactly as they plan. Well, I don't believe that, first of all, simply because the families and banking houses and corporate structures that are currently the root of the problem weren't always there. This is a problem, just like he says, that goes back not decades, but actually centuries. And if you add to the perspective that I took in Babylon's Banksters, actually millennia. But he is correct, centuries. And eventually I want to begin within the next 4 to 5 months a sequel to Babylon's Banksters, and it will be picking up the story, so to speak, where I kind of left it off. And I hope to get into the beginning of the roots of this problem about 5 or 6 centuries ago. All right. But he's correct. But anyway, let me return to his comment. These events have been building up for decades, if not centuries, and it's bound to boil over. A small part of me hopes that the Germans do in fact play a prominent role, if not the role, for the European nations and peoples. Weird, huh? I simply cannot help it. I just fear what my children and my grandchildren would have to endure if China or Russia become top dogs. I also have a question, Dr. Farrell. How does all of this connect together? I mean, all of the ancient races with the large skulls, the giants, the peoples on this earth, and these, quote, Nazis, unquote, who are slowly gathering political power. Other than an obviously harmful ideology, how does our ancient past tie in with these, quote, Nazis, unquote? What does the God or the gods have in store for us? I have trouble piecing all of this together, unquote. And that was a really interesting comment because I thought that I needed to speak to that a bit because people ask me what I think the grand picture is. How do Nazis fit in with all this? And the basic answer I think that we have to give is that if you look at the activity of the banksters over the millennia, over the last few centuries, over the last few decades, on that side of the equation, you are dealing quite literally with a breakaway civilization. It's a matter of some record that, at least as far as the American component of this Anglo-American corporate elite, at least as far as that component is concerned, you're dealing with an elite that before World War II was powerful enough to quite literally blackmail the federal government at certain key points of federal policy by refusing corporate cooperation with the policies that they wanted to pursue, that the government wanted to pursue. So, in other words, it clearly had the attitude of itself as an elite above and beyond the power of the nation state. So that attitude, it has been there. It has been there since prior to World War II. The important point to note is that that elite, and I'm speaking strictly now of the American component of that elite. I'm not speaking of the City of London component, because that's a slightly different issue that I want to get into in just a second. But the American component of that elite did interface very directly with the corporate components that were backing the Nazi Party, and specifically with Interessengemeinschaft Farbenindustrie, otherwise known as IG Farben. Farben was immensely powerful. We just have no idea today how hugely powerful that corporation was. And it was both the German and American cartelists that helped create that immensely powerful corporation. All right. You had that nexus, therefore, pre-war between an elite in Germany and an elite in America that viewed itself as being above the day-to-day machinations of the politics of their respective countries, and for that matter, above the class interest of the middle class in each country. Now, what happened was you added Nazism to that mix. And Nazism, there are two components of Nazi ideology that he brings up here that I think are very, very interesting. When you add Nazism to the mix, what you're also adding, in addition to this idea of class superiority, you're adding to it the idea of race superiority. And that certainly was an idea that was current within the American power structure, the American power elite, chiefly around the Morgan-Rockefeller interests. They had that view of kind of a racial superiority as well. And in fact, most of you are probably aware that group or that interest within the American part of this international structure was deeply and heavily involved in the support of eugenics research. All right. And that later, of course, becomes the model for the Nazi laws inside of Nazi Germany. So the Nazi Party adds kind of a boost towards this idea of racial superiority. Now, the second component of Nazi ideology that I think is very, very crucial to understand the post-war situation is that it was Nazi ideology, it was the Nazi Party that believed that in ancient times there was indeed a contact with somebody from off-world, and it was part of the thinking in the background that molded the Nazi Party, that this contact indeed led to the creation of a superior race of humans as opposed to all other humans. In other words, it was that admixture of somebody else plus us that created what the Nazis were thinking were the Aryan race, the super race, the Superman, that had been corrupted in turn by its mingling, its interbreeding with the other races on Earth. So there is a crucial ideological component that Nazism injects into this very, very deadly mix. So what I'm looking at, I think, and this is something that I hope to be clarifying in future books, because we talk about Nazism, we talk about the Anglo-American elite, but it's important to note that on the Anglo-American elite side of the equation, you're dealing with two major interests. Mr. Paolo Trapanese has pointed this out in a number of comments on the website, and he's also mentioned it in some comments on my Facebook page. In that situation, you're dealing with two very different components represented by the Rockefeller interest and the Rothschild interest. And there is already there a fissure, a kind of an incipient crack or schism within the structure, because the Rothschilds, of course, are heavily committed to Zionism, to the support of the state of Israel, and so on and so forth, whereas the Rockefeller interest are more representative of what we in the United States would call the American Protestant uh, moneyed class. So they have tended to look down on that aspect of the Rothschild interest, and that incidentally I think is one of the major factors why it allied itself with the Nazi Party. And that alliance, I'm again, as I said, I'm writing a book. It's not an exciting book, but it's a necessary one about why you see this nexus between Nazism and the American corporate interest, both pre-war and post-war. That's the important thing to understand here, folks, is that that nexus was reestablished prior to the end of World War II, and it continued for a very long period after the end of the war between the American corporate interests, chiefly represented by the Morgan-Rockefeller group, and the Nazi Party, the structure of what I'm calling the Nazi International. Now, that interest, this is a long history, and that's kind of the big picture. That's kind of the way I see it. I do think that relationship has broken down. I do think you're seeing now the emergence of some real tensions, some real factional infighting within that post-war Anglo-American Nazi nexus. I hope to address that eventually someday in a book, but in order to do so adequately, I have to go back in history and follow the argument that I made in Babylon's Banksters forward to this point. But anyway, I thought that was a really interesting comment, and I wanted to comment about it. Again, as always, I want to remind people that we're still working on the idea of the video conference on the website. We're going to be doing some tests this month, as a matter of fact, of the technology that's going to be used. So please watch my Facebook page. Please watch the actual website, because we're planning to have a free test of this technology for anybody that is a member that wants to volunteer to help us test this technology when we get ready to do that. So anyway, that's it for news and views from the Nefarium for the week of September 2nd, 2011. If there's any more news this weekend, of course, I'll be back with a flash update on news and views. But anyway, we'll see you on the flip side, everybody, and God bless.